we have commuted the sentence of Rod Blagojevich. He served 8 years in jail. It's a long time, and I watched his wife on television. I don't know him very well. I met him a couple of times. He was on for a short while on The Apprentice years ago. It was a prosecution by the same people, Comey, Fitzpatrick, the same group, very far from his children. They're growing older. They're going to high school now, and they rarely get to see their father outside of an orange uniform. I saw that, and I did commute his sentence.
Well, Donald Trump is commuting Rod Blagojevich's 14-year prison sentence. He served, I believe, 8 years. The president's right on that. In 2009, the former Illinois governor was impeached, removed from office, and later sent to federal prison for essentially trying to sell Barack Obama's vacated Senate seat when he became president. Trump's decision this afternoon to help a former Celebrity Apprentice contestant is prompting a natural follow-up question. Is he trying to send a message to another associate still wrapped up in the legal system? The New York Times reports, quote, in conversations with advisors, Mr. Trump has also raised the prospect of commuting the sentence of, bingo, Roger Stone, his longest-serving advisor, who was convicted in November of seven felony charges. And the clock is ticking right now. Stone today lost his bid to delay sentencing in his trial. He'll be sentenced on Thursday, 2 days hence, as planned. Let's go to the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker, and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman. Here with me in the studio is Carol Lee, our correspondent at NBC News, and politics reporter of the Daily Beast, Betsy Wood-Swan. So many people here. Let's go to Peter first. Peter, there's so many possible motives. So let's go through the top one. Is this to send a signal to Roger Stone? Sit tight. I'll get to you, baby.
Well, whether it's intended to or not, it could certainly be interpreted that way, right? In other words, he's been very clear the last week that he thinks what happened to Roger Stone is unfair, unjust. By the way, also Michael Flynn, his former national security advisor, who also faces sentencing at some point soon. And I think that you can interpret this as, it may be interpreted on the receiving end anyway, as this is somebody who takes care of his friends. He said today, the president did, somebody has to speak up for these people. And he's made clear that's going to be him, even if the attorney general doesn't want him to.
I wonder how much of this, my first instinct watching it is political. And I think there's a lot of people from Eastern Europe, a lot of ethnic people, we used to call them white working people around the Chicago area, the suburbs. You know, it's a sending a signal of regard to this guy. We've had so many governors of Illinois that have gone to prison. It's ridiculous. They made a whole movie about it, The Good Wife, the TV series, which I watched every one. It's part of this political, that there's a constituency behind, we call him on our show, B-Rod, Rod Blagojevich. Is there a crowd out there that's going to like this? Peter.
Yeah, I think that's possible. And I think that you know, he also is, I think, personally sympathetic to or empathizing with people like Rod Blagojevich, who he feels had been persecuted by prosecutors. Remember who Blagojevich was prosecuted by Patrick Fitzgerald, who's a friend of Jim Comey's. It was his, in other words, and the president mentioned that today in speaking with reporters just outside of Air Force One, that this was a Comey prosecution in his view. So he has already now voided this prosecution. He also pardoned Scooter Libby, who was Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, also prosecuted by Jim Comey's friend, Pat Fitzgerald. So there's no question about it that there's this connection in his view between these cases and the cases of him and his friends who he feels have been treated unfairly by the old FBI and Justice Department.
Harry, what do you make of this knocking it down to 8 years? Is that reasonable?
No, look, not really. I think we've replaced, this is of a piece, Chris, with the Stone change from last week itself. There are procedures in place for who gets a pardon, when you get a pardon. Have you shown remorse? Has it been 5 years since your conviction was served? There's a whole, you know, apparatus and professional people on the ground. You know, Trump completely ignores all that. And I think the criterion for, you know, for Bloggy and DeBartolo and others is they're Trump's kind of guys. You know, that's about it. Yeah. Is 8 years reasonable? No, you know, he got more under the guidelines, just as Stone should. It's completely ignoring the system that's in place to try to keep things equal and procedurally consistent among defendants.
Carol, how much of this is just to show his arbitrariness? Because I can do it to anybody I want to. Like, I can make Rush Limbaugh a citizen forever. You know, I mean, right. A national, what do they call it? what do you call it, the Medal of Freedom. I mean, just give it to anybody who I like that day.
There's definitely an element of that. There's an element of that in a lot of things that President Trump does. Presidential pardon power is so definitive, and it's the one space in which he can really be king, and it's up to him, and he gets to decide. We've seen him do this with military cases and with the regular justice system cases. One of the things that's interesting about
and war criminal situations, which is really scary, jumping into that stuff.
And if you look at the president's been teasing the Blagojevich one for some time and didn't do it. But one of the things that he talked about, and this was back in August when he was talking about doing this, was that it was just a phone call. And so you can see how the president relates to, as others were saying, he can relate to what, or sees some of what feels like he's been through in some of these individuals. And so he was saying it was just a phone call. People have worse phone calls. And obviously the president...
How smart is Trump, Betsy? Is he smart enough to know that this looks like compassion? He talked about Blagojevich's wife, Patty. He talked about the kids in high school only seeing their father in an orange jumpsuit. He talked about it in the way that most people would talk about a case like this. They know the guy. They like him. His family's going through hell. 8 years is enough. It sounds human
He
almost.
also has likely seen Patty on Fox News. She's been on the network more than half a dozen times.
So it's real.
That family has been trying. Look, it seems like it's not a coincidence that when people make arguments on Fox, Trump often ends up believing those arguments. What we can also very safely surmise about this whole situation is that Trump is thinking about all these pardons in the same way he thinks about everything, which is, will my base like it? And the Trump base is going to be totally fine with him pardoning Blagojevich, even though Blagojevich was a Democrat, because Trump is as enthusiastic about it. Same thing, and importantly, same thing with Bernie Kerik, former New York law enforcement official, an ally
business
of Rudy
partner.
Giuliani's, and then subsequent to his...
Okay, let me ask that to Harry, the legal question there. This is pretty close to Trump. If he lets off Bernie Kerik, he's going very close to his sort of wheelhouse there, his political wheelhouse.
I mean, that's right. I mean, to me, I totally agree with Betsy. First and foremost, how does this play with the base? It's the lodestar and for everything that he's doing. And just the feel of these guys when you bring them together, Kerik, DeBartolo, Blago, they all feel like the kind of guys that Trump's base would champion. But again, I just want to point out, no one's gone through any of the analysis of who gets a pardon and why. He's got the raw power, but it's always in the past been exercised according to all these procedures through professional people. That's all thrown out the window here, just as with the Stone sentencing.
Harry, quickly, what do you think in these last days of December this year, no matter if he wins or loses, say if he loses, okay?
Yeah.
Can he just go through it like some of these congressmen hire all their relatives and fire all their regular staff? Some of these people just say, screw you. I'm going to enjoy this job. The last 3 months, I'll go to my cousins in the house. I've seen this happen. Can he do it?
Very quickly, answer is yes.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.